Imagine the skies of Europe in the late 1930s, skies that still look peaceful from the ground but feel heavy with something coming. Nations are rearming, air forces are expanding, and the idea of another world war is no longer a fear from the past. It's a countdown. Britain watches the continent fall into crisis, and it understands a brutal truth. If war comes, the next decisive battlefield won't only be land or sea, it will be the air above the island itself. Because if an enemy can win the sky, it can bomb your factories, your ports, your cities, and finally your will to fight. If it can destroy your fighter force and your early warning system, it can prepare the way for invasion. And in the summer of 1940, that is exactly the scenario Britain faces. France has fallen. The evacuation at Dunkirk has saved an army, but it has not won a war. Britain is alone, exposed, threatened, and surrounded by the feeling that the next step is inevitable. Across the English Channel, Germany holds the strongest air force in Europe, the Luftwaffe, and now the question becomes painfully simple. Can Britain stop it? This is where one aircraft steps out of engineering and into myth, not because it fought alone, not because it was perfect, not because it magically made Britain invincible, but because it arrived at the exact moment when Britain needed a weapon that could look Germany in the eye and fight on equal terms. That aircraft is the Supermarine Spitfire, and the battle that made it immortal is the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign in history fought primarily in the air, where the fate of a nation was decided by radar screens, radio calls, scrambled squadrons, and seconds of gunfire at high altitude. To understand why the Spitfire mattered so much, you have to understand what Britain was trying to do. Britain wasn't trying to conquer Germany. It wasn't trying to push a front line east. Britain was trying to survive. And survival in 1940 meant one thing above all: keeping Fighter Command alive. Because if Fighter Command collapsed, if the RAF could no longer contest the air, Germany could bomb at will and prepare for invasion. Even if invasion never came, the destruction would be enough to force political surrender. So the Luftwaffe's core mission was to break Britain's air defense system and destroy its fighters. Britain's mission was to prevent that long enough for Germany to lose momentum, lose aircraft, lose pilots, and eventually give up on the idea that Britain could be forced out of the war. But the Spitfire's story doesn't begin in 1940. It begins earlier, in the interwar years, when aviation was evolving at incredible speed, and Britain's aircraft culture was driven by a strange mix of competition, pride, and engineering obsession. One of the most important influences on the Spitfire's DNA was the racing world, especially the high-profile competitions that pushed designers to build faster, sleeker, more refined aircraft. In those contests, every detail mattered: cooling, drag, power, materials, and the brutal lesson that air is not forgiving. Designers learned to respect speed, not as a luxury, but as a philosophy. In air combat, speed isn't only about chasing or escaping, it's about choosing when to fight and when to break away. Speed is control. At the center of the Spitfire story stands Reginald J. Mitchell, the designer whose career helped shape Britain's most famous fighter silhouette. Mitchell was not designing a museum piece or a patriotic icon. He was designing a machine to win in a world where technology was moving faster than politics. The early concept that became the Spitfire flew in 1936, and even then, people could sense they were looking at something different. The Spitfire didn't just look modern, it looked like it belonged to the future. The fuselage was sleek, the cockpit was enclosed, the landing gear retracted, and the wings, those iconic elliptical wings, were not simply artistic flair. They were part of a serious aerodynamic goal: efficiency. The wing shape helped reduce drag and distribute lift smoothly. The overall aircraft, built around a powerful engine, was designed to climb quickly, fly fast, and turn with precision. There's a tragedy in this story too. Mitchell did not live long enough to see the Spitfire become what it became. He died in 1937, before the aircraft's true moment arrived. But the team around him carried the design forward, and by the time war loomed, Britain had something that could be produced, upgraded, and pushed to its limits. When people talk about the Spitfire, they usually talk about performance. And yes, performance matters, but performance is not one thing. It's speed, climb, turn rate, dive behavior, stability, visibility, armament, reliability, and, most importantly, how all of that feels to a pilot under stress. The Spitfire's heart was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and the Merlin was one of the engines that defined the war. It gave the Spitfire the power to fight at the altitudes where battles over Britain would often be decided. It wasn't only raw horsepower, it was the ability to sustain speed and climb in real combat conditions. And because the Spitfire could turn tightly and respond quickly, it gave skilled pilots a sense that they could place the aircraft in the sky where they needed it to be. But here's the part that many myth-filled retellings forget. The Spitfire did not save Britain alone. If you want the honest version of history, you have to say it clearly. The Battle of Britain was won by a system, and the Spitfire was one of the sharpest weapons in that system. The RAF had two main frontline fighters during the battle, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricane was less glamorous, but it was absolutely essential. It was available in larger numbers and did enormous work against bomber formations. The Spitfire, meanwhile, was often used to engage the Luftwaffe's fighter escorts, especially the Messerschmitt Bf 109, so the Hurricanes could focus on the bombers. This isn't a perfect rule that applied to every raid, but it describes a real tactical pattern. The Hurricane, stable and effective as a gun platform, tearing into bombers. The Spitfire, fast and agile, trying to keep the Bf 109s busy so the bombers could be hit. If you want to understand what saving Britain means, you need to understand the Dowding System, Britain's integrated air defence network. Britain's great advantage in 1940 was not simply courage, it was organisation. The Dowding System connected early warning, radar detection, observer reports, command centres, sector stations, and squadrons of fighters into one coordinated machine. Radar stations along the coast could detect incoming raids, estimate numbers and directions, and send that information into command centres that then vectored fighters to intercept. That meant Britain didn't have to keep fighters permanently in the air, burning fuel and exhausting pilots. It could conserve strength and launch interceptions at the right time. It could avoid wasting squadrons on feints. It could fight smarter, not just harder. Germany had power, Britain had efficiency, and this matters because the RAF's biggest vulnerability wasn't the aircraft, it was the pilots. You can build new planes if your factories survive, but you cannot instantly create experienced fighter pilots. Training takes time, and combat experience can't be manufactured. Every trained pilot lost was a wound that couldn't quickly heal. The Dowding System helped reduce unnecessary losses by making interceptions more controlled and less desperate. Now place that system into the summer of 1940. The Battle of Britain begins in the Channel battles and grows into something larger and more terrifying. The Luftwaffe's goals shift over time, but the central purpose remains: break fighter command. Early on, German raids focus on shipping and ports, pushing Britain to respond and revealing patterns in RAF defence. Then the pressure intensifies. Airfields become targets, fighter bases are attacked, runways are cratered, hangars burn, aircraft are destroyed on the ground. Sector stations, the nerve centres of the system, are threatened. Ground crew work through smoke and rubble, because if a squadron can't refuel and rearm quickly, it cannot fight multiple sorties per day. And the battle becomes not just about one dogfight, but about endurance. Who can keep operating tomorrow? In this environment, the Spitfire's importance becomes clear. The Luftwaffe's primary escort fighter in 1940 is the Bf 109E. It is fast, heavily armed for its time, and flown by pilots who have already gained experience in earlier campaigns. In many ways, the battle is defined by the duel between Britain's best fighter and Germany's best fighter. The Spitfire didn't need to dominate the Bf 109 to matter. It needed to be good enough that the RAF could contest the sky rather than avoid it. Because if Britain had been forced to rely on aircraft that could not face the Bf 109 effectively, German escorts would have controlled the fight and bombers would have operated with fewer consequences. The Spitfire's presence meant the Luftwaffe could not simply sweep the RAF aside. Every raid became a risk. Every bomber formation needed protection. Every German pilot knew that the Spitfires could arrive and challenge them. Dogfights in 1940 were not clean duels. They were violent, chaotic, and brutally fast. Picture the reality. You climb into a cockpit that smells like oil and leather. You hear the Merlins roar. You feel vibration through the airframe. You're cold at altitude, wearing heavy gear, oxygen mask, goggles. Your vision is partly blocked by canopy frames. Your radio crackles with short calls. Then you see it, tiny dots turning into aircraft shapes as they close. 1 second you're scanning the sky, the next second tracer rounds cut through cloud. A burst can shred an engine or ignite fuel. A small mistake can stall a wing or put you into the sights of an enemy you never even saw. Most kills in this kind of combat are not heroic, face-to-face movie moments. They happen because someone has a positional advantage, altitude, speed, surprise, and the victim has seconds to react. Often they don't. And that brings us to tactics. Early in the war, the RAF still used formations that were not always ideal for the kind of fast, high-energy fighting demanded by 1940. The Luftwaffe, influenced by Spanish Civil War experience, used looser, more flexible formations like the Finger 4 arrangement, which allowed pilots better visibility and mutual support. The RAF would adapt over time, but early tactical mismatch added pressure to pilots who were already under strain. The Spitfire helped compensate for some of this because it had handling and performance that rewarded skill. A good pilot could turn that aircraft into a weapon, even if the tactical doctrine wasn't perfect. But Britain's real genius was that it kept learning while fighting. Squadrons adapted, controllers got better, the system refined itself under pressure. Another thing that shaped the battle was geography. Britain was fighting over home territory. That meant RAF pilots who were shot down often had a chance to survive and return. They might parachute into fields, be rescued by civilians, and fly again. German pilots shot down over Britain became prisoners. That difference is enormous in a battle where trained pilots are the most precious resource. Britain also had shorter flight times to the combat zone, which meant less fuel spent just reaching the fight. The Luftwaffe faced a different problem: range. The Bf 109's combat radius was limited. German fighters escorting bombers across the Channel often had only a limited time over target before they had to return. That meant bombers could be left vulnerable at the worst moment, when the RAF was counter-attacking, and it meant German pilots were often fighting with fuel anxiety in the back of their minds. Can I keep chasing, or do I have to break off to get home? So the battle becomes a contest, not just of aircraft, but of time and distance. The Spitfire didn't have to cross the Channel. It could scramble, climb, fight, and land again within the same defensive umbrella. It could be repaired and returned to service quickly. Britain could rotate squadrons between sectors to relieve exhausted units. The Luftwaffe had to project power across water, maintain bomber formations, and escort them while staying within strict fuel constraints. Every minute mattered. Now add the human dimension. The Battle of Britain was fought by young men, often in their early 20s, living in a constant cycle of tension and exhaustion. Scramble bell rings, sprint to aircraft, take off, climb, fight, land, debrief, and sometimes scramble again before you've even had a real meal. Fear becomes normal. Loss becomes routine. Empty beds in squadron quarters become an unspoken fact of life. And yet the machine keeps running because if it stops, Britain loses. This is the context in which the Spitfire becomes a symbol. It is not only a fighter, it becomes a visible representation of resistance. People on the ground look up and see Spitfires climbing through cloud, and they understand that someone is fighting for them. The Spitfire's shape becomes linked with the idea that Britain can still hit back. It becomes part of morale, part of national identity, part of a story Britain tells itself to keep going. But the Spitfire had weaknesses, and acknowledging them makes the story more real, not less. One famous early weakness involved negative G maneuvers. Early Merlin carburetors could briefly cut out under negative G conditions, which meant that in certain sudden pushover dives, the engine could starve and stutter at the worst possible moment. German aircraft with fuel injection systems were less vulnerable to that exact issue, and some German pilots could exploit it by pushing into negative G dives that the Spitfire had to follow carefully. Britain responded with practical solutions, small engineering changes and pilot techniques that reduced the problem until later improvements made it less significant. This is a perfect example of what wartime innovation looks like. Not always dramatic new inventions, but small fixes that prevent deaths. Another truth, the Spitfire's early armament, multiple rifle-caliber machine guns, could be devastating, but it required pilots to get close and land sustained hits. In chaotic combat, that was not always easy, and as the war progressed, firepower demands increased. The Spitfire's evolution over the years is partly a story of adapting to changing threats, improving engines, improving propellers, improving armament, and increasing performance at different altitudes. But in 1940, it was already good enough to do what Britain needed it to do: fight, survive, and keep the Luftwaffe from achieving air superiority. Now let's walk through the emotional arc of the battle. In July 1940, the pressure begins to rise. In August, it grows into a storm. Luftwaffe raids increase in size and intensity. Britain's airfields suffer. Sector stations are hit. At certain moments, fighter command is stretched to the edge. There are days when squadrons are exhausted and aircraft are damaged faster than they can be repaired. This is when the battle is most dangerous for Britain, not because Britain is cowardly, but because war is arithmetic. If the RAF loses too many aircraft and too many pilots too quickly, it collapses. And Germany knows this. Germany pushes. But Germany makes strategic choices that matter. At times, the Luftwaffe targets radar stations, but radar proves harder to eliminate than expected, and stations can often be repaired quickly. At times, German focus turns toward airfields, and that pressure is real. Then later, the targeting shifts more toward London and major cities, and the battle enters a new psychological phase, the Blitz era, where civilian suffering becomes central. Strategically, shifting focus away from fighter command's most critical infrastructure gives the RAF breathing room. Whether this shift was a mistake, an adaptation, or a political reaction is debated, but the effect is clear. Britain's fighter system survives, continues fighting, and regains stability. In the middle of this, one phrase becomes eternal. Churchill's speeches capture the mood of Britain, and one line becomes the summary of the battle in popular memory. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase is powerful because it compresses a vast complex system into a human image. A small number of fighter pilots holding the fate of millions. And in one sense, that's true. But it's also true that the few included more than the pilots who pulled triggers. It included the radar operators who spotted raids, the observers who tracked aircraft visually, the controllers who coordinated interceptions, the ground crews who kept planes flyable, the factory workers who built replacements, and the civilians who endured bombing without breaking. The Spitfire symbolizes all of that because it is the part of the system you can see. There were also internal debates within Britain's defence structure. The battle wasn't fought by one unified mind. It was fought by humans under pressure, and humans disagree. One famous controversy involved the idea of concentrating fighters into large formations, what some called the Big Wing, versus sending squadrons up quickly in smaller numbers to meet raids as soon as possible. One approach emphasized massed firepower, the other emphasized rapid response and control. These debates weren't abstract, they were about life and death, and they reveal something important. Britain's defense was not perfect, but it was resilient. It could argue and still function. It could debate and still adapt. It could make mistakes and still survive because the overall system was strong enough to absorb friction and keep operating. So where does the Spitfire fit into the outcome? It fits at the point where individual combat performance meets strategic necessity. The Spitfire did not win the battle by itself, but it played a critical role by giving Britain a fighter capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best escort aircraft. That prevented Germany from clearing the sky of RAF fighters. It forced the Luftwaffe to fight for every raid. It increased German losses and reduced German confidence. It helped keep bomber formations exposed to hurricanes and other RAF fighters. And it contributed to the psychological message that Britain was not helpless. Every time a Spitfire climbed into combat and returned, it reinforced the idea that the RAF could endure. By late 1940, the Luftwaffe had not achieved its goal. Fighter command was battered but alive. Britain had not surrendered. The invasion threat faded because without air superiority, an invasion across the Channel would be catastrophic. The battle ended not with a single dramatic moment, but with a slow realization. Germany could not break Britain quickly, and the cost of continuing to try was too high. Britain had survived the most direct attempt to remove it from the war, and the Spitfire's story didn't end there. The Spitfire would evolve through many variants, improving engines, improving armament, improving speed and altitude performance. It would fight across Europe, across the Mediterranean, in different roles and different climates. It would become one of the most produced and most beloved fighters of the entire war. But the Battle of Britain remained its defining myth because it was the moment the Spitfire became inseparable from national survival. It wasn't just a fighter anymore. It was a symbol that a free country had looked at the greatest military force in Europe and refused to kneel. So when people say, the Spitfire saved Britain, what do they really mean? They mean that in 1940, Britain needed a weapon that could hold the sky long enough for everything else to matter. Britain needed time to rebuild, time for allies to mobilize, time for Germany's momentum to slow, time for the war to expand into a conflict Germany could not easily control. The Spitfire helped buy that time. It helped keep the air war from turning into a one-sided destruction. It helped protect the system that protected Britain. But the deepest lesson of the Battle of Britain is this: a nation's survival is rarely the product of one miracle. It is the product of preparation, systems, people, and the ability to adapt under fire. The Spitfire became the face of that survival because it was visible, beautiful, and deadly, because it turned fear into something Britain could fight with. And when you see the Spitfire today, restored, gleaming, its Merlin engine still capable of that unmistakable roar, you're not only seeing a Wapu-2 aircraft, you're seeing the shape of a moment when the sky decided the fate of an island and a fighter became the symbol of defiance. If you want to carry the message of this story into a single image, imagine this: a Spitfire climbing hard through broken cloud, sunlight catching its wings for a second like a flash of silver, while below Britain burns and endures. Somewhere ahead, enemy aircraft approach. The pilot tightens his grip. The radio crackles. The engine roars. And the Spitfire, born from speed and shaped by necessity, dives into history. Because in that moment, it isn't just fighting for a victory in the air. It's fighting for the survival of a country.